Hey everybody, welcome to Blue HQ. Have you ever wondered how the modern dive watch evolved? Well, you're gonna find out today. Hi, welcome to the Blue HQ. And if you're new to the channel, welcome. My name is Jonathan Bird. I am an underwater cinematographer. I've been doing it for over 30 years. My main business these days is giant screen films like 3D IMAX documentaries that show in museums and science centers. My most recent film is called Call of the Dolphins. There's a link, I'll put a link to it, I don't know, somewhere, so you can go check out the website. And my other thing is that I do a series here on YouTube called Jonathan Bird's Blue World, which is an underwater science adventure show. It's on a channel called Blue World TV, and you're on Blue World Plus, which is where we do our extras and our behind the scenes and content about scuba diving. And my latest passion is to do a series of videos about dive watches. I wouldn't consider myself to be an expert in the world of watches, but I am an expert in the world of diving. And I've been wearing a dive watch for a long time, and I love dive watches. Dive watches are cool. I collect them. I wear them every single day. And I did a video just recently about my dive watch journey. But then I thought this would be a great opportunity to basically take a look at the history of the dive watch and how we got to the dive watch that we have today. In the 1920s, a Swiss watchmaker named Jean Finger patented a sort of hermetically sealed case that you could put a watch in. It was like a housing for a watch. It had basically a lid that's screwed on, and you would take a watch and you would put it in there, kind of close it up, and then you had a watch that could go underwater, and it was dust-proof and dirt-proof. And several manufacturers actually used this design, including Rolex. In 1922, they released a watch with this design called the Submarine. But Hans Wilsdorf, the president and founder of Rolex, he didn't really love it because what he really wanted was a watch that was like a normal watch that could go underwater. You know, a watch that had a crown that you could just wind. The problem with the Submarine design was that you had to open the case, take the watch out, wind it, set it, put it back in, and close it. And that's actually pretty much what we do with cameras now. They don't make dedicated underwater video cameras. We take a regular camera that's designed for use in air, and we stick it in basically a box. It's called a housing. It's like an aluminum box. It's got little buttons with O-rings so it doesn't leak. You put the camera in, you close the back has a gasket on it, you seal it up, and we take it underwater and we film with it. And so it's not a totally unreasonable way to do an underwater watch, but it would be a lot more convenient if the watch could just go underwater and be a normal watch. So Hans Wilsdorf came up with the idea of the Oyster. And the Oyster design, so-called because it was as tight as an oyster, the Oyster design did two important things. Most watches at the time, they had a snap-on back, and it would keep out like dirt, but they weren't waterproof. What he did was he made the back of the watch round and threaded and stuck an O-ring on it. So when you screwed it down against that O-ring, the back of the watch was watertight. And then the other place that water could get in would be the crown. That's where you wind the watch or set the watch. And what he did there was he had a tube that came out of the case that was threaded, and you would basically have an O-ring in there. When you needed to wind or set the watch, you would unscrew the crown and it would pop out, and you could set it and wind it, and then you would screw it back down tight against the case, and it would compress another little O-ring in there and make the crown waterproof. And so that basic design, which he called the Oyster, was waterproof, and that was a really big step towards the modern diving watch. And once he had the Oyster though, what he really needed was some publicity. So in 1927, a young woman named Mercedes Gleitze was planning to swim 20 miles across the English Channel from France to England in very cold water, and Hans Wilsdorf saw an opportunity. So he gave her an oyster, and she wore it. She actually wore it on a necklace so it wouldn't get in the way of swimming. She wore it on her swim across the English Channel. And when she got to the other side, it was dry. He, being the great marketing genius that he was, he rented out basically the entire front page of the Daily Mail in London for 40,000 francs, Swiss francs, which in today's dollars, that would be 700,000 US dollars. That's a lot of money. And he rented it out and he put in basically an ad, except he made it look like a headline. He made it look like this was such big news that the Daily Mail had to put it on the first page. And what that did was generate a huge amount of buzz for the Rolex Oyster. And that design, the Rolex Oyster design, is the design that we basically still have on dive watches that can go deep enough for diving. In 1932, Omega came along with a watch they called the Marine, and they claim that this is the first diver's watch. If you look at the design though, the design is really more like another watch that goes in a housing. It wasn't really a waterproof watch. It was a watch that went in a sliding case, and the case was waterproof when it was closed. The problem is that the design wasn't very robust, and just looking at it today, I mean, I've never seen one in person. I've never used one, but just by looking at it, knowing what I know about underwater stuff, I can't imagine that this housing watch would have been very reliable or waterproof in the long term. So I'm gonna say, in my opinion, that was not the first diver's watch. You have to take a step back and remember, in 1932, we didn't have any scuba divers. Everybody was in hard hats, which means you're kind of walking along the bottom in a suit with a big helmet, and you have a tube going to the surface that's pumping air down to you. And it was pretty primitive diving. So sport diving wasn't a thing. People didn't just go diving. This was for professional divers. Now, in 1936, along comes an Italian company called Panerai. And this is a very important pivotal moment in the development of what we consider a modern dive watch. Panerai was a company that made equipment for divers, things like compasses and depth gauges, and they were really good at making big, easy to see instruments that were waterproof. They wanted to develop a watch for the Italian Navy. The problem is they didn't know anything about making watches. They weren't a watch company. So they did what you would do. They called Rolex and they said, listen, we want a watch. And we want it to be pretty big so that it's really visible underwater. So could you guys make like an oyster case, but big, and put a movement in it? Now you have to understand that at the time, wristwatches were kind of new. Most people were carrying a pocket watch back in the days, you know, and they were big, right? And when wristwatches started becoming popular, the trend was to try to make them as small as possible, because that's how you show off what a great watchmaker you are, that you can miniaturize something like really weeny teeny and it would still work. And so the trend at the time was really small wristwatches. Like at the time, the Rolex Oyster was a tiny little watch. It was like, you know, 30 millimeters or something, tiny little thing. And these guys were saying, hey, we want a really big version of it. So Rolex made a big version of their Oyster case. And it was so big that they actually put a pocket watch movement in it. So you basically were wearing a pocket watch on your wrist. Now I know what you're asking right now. You're saying, well, if Rolex made the movement and Rolex made the case, why are we talking about Panerai? Panerai brought a very important innovation to the game, and that was the dial. See, remember, they specialized in making very highly visible underwater instruments. And so they wanted to bring that expertise to the dial of the watch. They came up with the idea of a very high contrast dial. So basically, the dial face was black. The indices and numbers and hands were white. So you have white on black, very easy to see underwater. But they wanted to take it one step further than that. They wanted those hands and those indices to glow. So if you were underwater and it was really dark, they would actually light up. You didn't need to put a flashlight on them or something. And that was a very innovative idea. But how they did it these days seems crazy. What they did was they got some radioactive material called radium, and they mixed it in with some other chemicals to make a paint out of it. And then they painted it on the hands and the dial and the indices, and they basically made a glowing dial on a watch. The problem is they did it with a radioactive material that's not super safe. And the only thing more sketchy than wearing radioactive material on your wrist is being the person that spends the entire day painting it onto the dials of watches. And it turned out that the people that were doing that in the factories were getting really sick from radiation poisoning and dying from it. So obviously they eventually had to phase out radium. And what they ended up using later was tritium, which is still radioactive, but much, much less radioactive. It didn't glow quite as brightly, but it was much, much safer. And of course, today we don't use any radioactive materials on a watch. But the watch dials we have now, to make them glow, you have to like charge them up. So you have to expose them to some light and let them like soak up the light, and then you go in someplace dark and it'll glow for a few hours. But if you leave your watch like in a dark place for a few days, it's not glowing anymore. Whereas the early watches with radium, they glowed on their own. They didn't need sunlight, and that was really cool. Now you might be wondering, what did they call the watch? They called it the Panerai Radiomere. And they actually still make that model. So what Panerai brought to the game was the dial. So up until this point, all of the watches were basically designed for military or commercial divers. And that's because scuba diving hadn't been invented yet. It wasn't until 1943 when Jacques Cousteau and Émile Gagnon invented the demand regulator, or what Jacques Cousteau called the aqualung. It was basically a device that allowed compressed gas from a tank that you could wear on your back to be released at a lower pressure into your lungs in response to inhaling. And it was actually, in retrospect, it seems like a really basic invention, but at the time it was very revolutionary. And this gave us the ability to swim around underwater without being connected to the surface with a hose. First, they used this invention for the French resistance during World War II to do underwater, demolition. But then Jacques Cousteau became who he was, a great underwater explorer, and he wrote books and made TV shows. And when I was a kid, I watched the undersea world of Jacques Cousteau on television, and I became enamored with the underwater world, and that's probably why I'm here today as a scuba diver, is because of Jacques Cousteau. In 1953, along comes the granddaddy of them all, the Rolex Submariner, and they made what many people consider to be the perfect watch, and they still make it, and it's a wonderful watch. They put all the ingredients together. They have a super strong watertight Oyster case, except they made it even more strong and watertight than the early Oysters. They made the watch a little bit bigger so that it was legible underwater. They had the high contrast dial like the Panerai. And in 1953, they were still using radium on the dial, so there was that. And then they added one extra thing, and that was a rotating bezel that allowed you to time your dive. Now you have to understand, if you're a diver, time is very important, because if you stay down too long, you will get decompression sickness, or what they call the bends. So you need to be able to time your dive so that you come up before you've been down too long and you get decompression sickness. And they came up with the idea of the rotating bezel because you can use it like a stopwatch, essentially. Okay, so let's demonstrate how the bezel works. So here's the bezel. It starts at 0, and it just counts time, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Now let's say we go in the water right now, and it's 4:30. And so I'm going to turn the bezel so that the 0 lines up with the minute hand. And now it's going to count my time of my dive, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, all the way around. And if I'm aiming to come up at 20 minutes, I just Wait till the hand gets to 20. And now what's interesting is that this was not actually that revolutionary of an idea by 1953, because in fact, Longines and other companies had been using the timer bezel on their aviation watches since the 1930s. So this was not new. It's basically like a stopwatch that's not that accurate. It's only accurate to like a minute, not like fractions of a second like a real chronograph would be. But it's good enough for timing a dive. A year or two after the Submariner was released, two other watches were released, the Blancpain 50 Fathom and the Zodiac Seawolf. So these three watches are sort of like the original trilogy of dive watches, and they all have pretty much the same formula with the high contrast dial, super duper waterproof, super tough, and the rotating bezel to track your dive. But what was really interesting about this is that when they first came out, everybody had bidirectional bezels. They could turn either way. When Blancpain came out with their watch, they had a one-way bezel, a unidirectional bezel. It would only turn counterclockwise. And the idea behind that was that if you bumped it, the only way you could bump it would be to make your dive seem like you'd been down longer than you had. And so it would make your dive shorter. So like, for example, now let's say that I bump the bezel. This is the reason for the one-way bezel. It won't turn clockwise. But if I'm supposed to come up at 20 minutes, if I bump it and I turn it counterclockwise, it moves 20 minutes up. And so I actually will do a shorter dive than 20 minutes. Whereas if I had a bidirectional bezel and I could turn the 20 minutes over to like here, I would do a dive that was too long by accident, and that would be dangerous. So the one-way bezel keeps you from doing a dive that's too long. But the true purpose of the bezel is a fidget spinner, because I just fidget with it all the time, because it just feels so nice. So if you have a one-way bezel that can only make your dive shorter, it's safer. Maybe not as convenient, but definitely safer. The one-way bezel was a really, really important invention. And now, every dive watch has a unidirectional one-way bezel. But it took a while because Blancpain had a patent on it. Just like Rolex had a patent on the lockdown what they called the trip-lock crown, the crown that had 3 O-rings in it and was super sealed. Rolex had the tightest seal of the crowns of all the watches. And the Blancpain, they had a patent on the unidirectional bezel. So nobody could use that until their patent ran out. The Rolex Submariner didn't get a unidirectional bezel until 1981, 30 years later almost. Jacques Cousteau very famously wore the Blancpain 50 Fathoms in his movie The Silent World, which in 1956 won the Academy Award. It was one of the most revolutionary documentaries of its time. And it really put that watch on the map. But as we're going to find out, Jacques Cousteau liked to wear a lot of watches. Basically, if you gave him a free watch, he would probably wear it. So he made a lot of different brands famous over the years. By the way, this whole group of watches, they were all basically watertight, guaranteed watertight to 100 meters, roughly 330 feet. And the Blancpain was actually called the Blancpain 50 Fathoms. That's the name of the watch. A fathom is 6 feet. So 50 fathoms is 300 feet, or roughly 100 meters. So all these watches were waterproof to 100 meters. In 1954, the Submariner, the Rolex bumped theirs up to 200 meters, where it stayed for a long time. And at the time, it was kind of considered like 200 meters is the deepest anybody's ever going to need to go. So that's fine. You don't need more than that. Also in 1954, Tudor appeared with their version of the Submariner. Tudor, of course, being Rolex's sister company, known for making watches of extremely high quality, but a little bit more affordably priced, as they still are, in fact. And the Tudor Submariner became a very popular watch. It's interesting to look at the prices of these watches at the time. So back in the 50s, a Rolex Submariner was about $150, and a Zodiac Seawolf was about $100. Doesn't seem like much of a difference now, but I mean, the Rolex was 50% more. And that explains why the US military bought a whole bunch of Zodiac Seawolves for the Navy, and they did not buy Rolexes in general. In today's prices, if you convert that $150 from the 50s, that's about $1,800 today for a Rolex Submariner. While the Seawolf at $100 would be about $1,200 today. Since both of those watches are still in production, it's interesting to look at what the companies actually charge for those same models today. A Zodiac Seawolf is still about $1,200, but the Rolex is 10 grand. So the Rolex has gone into being kind of a luxury product, while Zodiac has sort of remained true to their roots as an affordable tool diving watch. As scuba diving became more popular in the 1950s, a lot of other brands jumped into the scuba diving watch game. In 1957, Omega came to the party with the Omega Seamaster 300. And this one looked more like a normal dive watch of the time with high contrast dial. They had gone away from that weird sliding case thing. In 1958, Breitling came along with the Super Ocean, which I happen to think is one of the coolest looking vintage dive watches out there. Such a cool looking watch. In 1959, Longines had a very clever idea, which was to circumvent Blancpain's patent on the unidirectional bezel by changing the design just enough that they could get by without patent infringement. And what they did was they took the bezel from the outside of the watch that you turned by hand like this, and they put it underneath the crystal, basically inside the watch, and you turned it with a little knob, a second crown on the outside of the watch. And it was unidirectional, and it was also less likely to get bumped because you'd have to bump a tiny little crown in order to move it. So it was actually a really clever invention. It didn't really catch on, but it was pretty good forward thinking. And that watch, the Longines compressor from 1959, is a real classic. Now, it's worth noting that watches in that era did not have a date complication, which is to say there was no date window. The idea being you're underwater, you don't need to know the date. You need to know the time. In fact, all you really needed to know was the elapsed time. You probably didn't need to know the time of day either. But so when you look at watches of the era, none of them have a date. By the time we get to the 60s, scuba diving has become quite the popular sport. And a lot of stuff happened in the 1960s. Like, for example, Seiko came out with their first dive watch in 1965, which was the first Japanese dive watch on the market. In 1965, Oris also released its first dive watch, and they've done a reissue of the Oris 65 to celebrate that in their modern line of watches. And in 1965, Jaeger LeCoultre, or as we say in English, JLC, because we're bad at French, they introduced a really cool watch called the Polaris. And what they did was they took the Longines idea of the internal bezel and they combined it with one of the complications that they were famous for called the Memovox, which was basically an alarm in the watch. There was a second spring in the watch, and you wind that up separately from the spring that runs the watch, and you could set a little timer dial, and you had an alarm. And the idea would be you could set the alarm for when you need to come up, so you wouldn't stay too long. The problem was it was very hard to set it precisely. You need to set it within plus or minus like a minute. It was really hard to make it that accurate. So it turned out it was really more of just a cool thing than it was useful. But I mean, it was an advancement in scuba diving watches. And if you extrapolate that to the modern day, we actually have dive computers that do exactly that now with a very high degree of accuracy. So in a way, they were kind of ahead of their time. But 1965 was a big year for a company called Doxa. A Swiss company that had been around since 1889. They came up with some very interesting developments of the dive watch while working with Claude Wesley, who was one of Jacques Cousteau's divers. And he was really interested in watches and wanted to help develop like the perfect diving watch. And one of the things that they came up with was the idea that the bezel that rotated would also have on it the no decompression tables, so that you'd have like a quick reference if you were at, say 100 feet, you could look at your bezel, and when it gets to 100, you get out. So instead of worrying about the time, you just worried about the depth on your bezel. It was an interesting concept, but it actually is a handy visual guide to your no decompression limits, like basically right on your wrist. The Doxa also had a really tough, heavy-duty case, and it was immediately adopted by the US military and was issued to the Navy SEALs and everybody else that needed a dive watch. And of course, it didn't hurt Doxa that Jacques Cousteau's team started wearing the watch. And yeah, of course they did. Claude Wesley on the team actually helped develop it. So once the whole team was wearing that watch, it got a lot of publicity. And it was one of the first watches that was really aggressively priced to appeal to the average sport diver who didn't have a lot of money. And so you had a lot of Doxas out there between the US military and the sport divers wearing them. Became a very popular watch. Doxa had some other interesting innovations. They came up with the very first underwater chronograph, basically like a stopwatch that you could run underwater, and the little buttons, they wouldn't leak. The other thing that they came up with, which is just a really great invention, is they were the first company to put the crown at 4 o'clock. On a normal dive watch, the crown at 3 o'clock can bite into the back of your hand, especially if it's being pushed up by your wetsuit. And they moved the crown to 4 o'clock to alleviate that problem. What's interesting is that it didn't really take off that much with Doxa. They still have a watch, the 600T, that has that feature, but none of their other watches do. Yet Seiko ran with the ball on that one. And I have come to like sort of identify Seiko is like, that's their thing. Their classic look is the 4 o'clock crown. And I have several Seiko watches that all have that 4 o'clock crown. And it's one of the things that really attracted me to the watch at the beginning, is just because it doesn't bite into the back of your hand. In the 1970s, diving was really trying to push the limits for commercial diving, going deeper and deeper, working on deep water wells, oil wells and things like that, and saturation diving. They were trying to push watches deeper and deeper. So it became like, you know, when digital cameras came along, there was this race to have the most megapixels. But when dive watches came along, there was this race to go deeper. Even though really nobody needed a watch that went deeper than 200 meters, they had to do it. So for example, Rolex came up with the Sea Dweller, which was like a bigger, beefier version of the Submariner that could go to 600 meters instead of 200 meters. And they had to be outdone, of course, so Omega came up with the Seamaster 1000 that would go to 1,000 meters. And it was basically a race for bragging rights, because not too many divers really needed watches that could go that deep. Certainly not sport divers. But in the commercial diving world, they were starting to do saturation diving. And what that means is that you do a dive, but you're so deep that you're going to need 2 or 3 days of decompression in order to come back up. And so they stick you in a decompression tank and bring you back up on the boat and stick you on the deck of the boat in this big decompression chamber. And they decompress you over a series of days. So you're dry, you're out of the water, but you're still at a high pressure, because they can't bring you down too fast, because your blood will basically boil from all of the bubbles in it. So you have to just go really slowly. And so they were doing this saturation diving, and they were taking divers deeper and deeper and deeper, and they wanted to have watches that could keep up. And so that's where this whole kind of space race came from with the dive watches. Meanwhile, over in the scuba diving world, the sport divers probably didn't need a watch that could go deeper than 100 meters, and most people still don't to this day. I only know a handful of people that would have ever pushed the limits of a 200-meter dive watch, never mind a 600 or 1,000-meter dive watch. Omega came up with a funky watch called the Plo-Prof, which is kind of famous. Plo-Prof stands for Plongeur Professionnel, which basically just means professional diver in French. And somebody shortened it and they called it Plo-Prof, which is kind of goofy, but it works. And that was a watch that had a button on the right-hand side that locked the bezel. So you push the button to unlock the bezel, you turn the bezel to wherever you want it, then you unlock, you release the button and lock the bezel, and it won't move. But because the button was on the right, they had to put the crown on the left. And to me, I thought that was just a brilliant design, because now the crown is completely out of the way of hitting your wrist. And you'd say, well, but now you have to work it with your left hand, so you have to take it off your wrist. Well, yeah, but I mean, nobody sets their watch underwater. Who cares? The other thing is, you know, if you're actually left-handed, which means you wear your watch on your right, then it actually is like a lefty watch, kind of. but I don't know, it's cool. But that watch also had one other thing that was really unique about it, in that it didn't have a case back. You couldn't take the case back off. They wanted to make it as waterproof as possible. The only way you could service the watch would be to take the crystal off the top to get the movement out from the top. So in a normal watch, you can take the crystal off to service it, but you can also just take the back off to service it. You don't have to take the crystal out. In the Ploprof, to service it, you would have to take the crystal out to get to the movement. Another watch I'd like to mention, in 1997, Sinn, a German company, came out with a watch that was filled with oil so that it was incompressible, and it could basically go to any diving depth. The problem is, if you fill a watch with oil, you have a problem with making the movement work in a viscous fluid. So they couldn't put a mechanical movement in the watch. It was a quartz movement. And I got to imagine it was really messy to change the battery. Probably the last big innovation in dive watches that we see today came again from Rolex, and that is the ceramic bezel insert. For the longest time, the bezels on the dive watches were either just stainless steel, and the markers in them were just sort of, machined into them and then painted, and then the paint would wear off and they looked terrible. Or it was an aluminum insert where the writing on the bezel was put on with anodizing, and the anodizing would fade over time, which of course gives a vintage watch a cool vintage look if it's got a faded bezel, but they didn't hold up that well, and they scratched a lot, and it was a service item that people would get replaced a lot because it was always getting scratched up. So Rolex came up with the idea of doing the bezel insert out of this ceramic material that's basically scratch proof, and it's really, really tough. And it kind of always looks great. That really became a cool thing that everybody copied, and I think it was a good thing. I think the ceramic bezel insert really makes watches look good and hold up well, especially if you actually wear them scuba diving, which I realize that not many people do. But if you do, that really helps the watch hold up well. And so these days, there is actually an ISO standard for what makes a dive watch. And that ISO standard evolved from all of these innovations that came along in the history of the dive watch. It's ISO 6425 if you want to look it up, but it basically means, they say in this set of specs, like the watch has to be waterproof to at least 100 meters, it has to have a unidirectional bezel for timing the dive, it has to have high contrast hands and watch face and luminous material so that you can see it in dim or dark waters. It has to be highly shock proof, magnetically resistant. Basically, it has to be really tough. And those specs all kind of came from this evolution of the dive watch, of what we had along the line to get to where we are today. Well, everybody, if you stuck with me through this whole video, thank you and congratulations. We got through another one. I'm going to be talking in my next video about the helium escape valve. It's such a big topic that I really wanted to give it its own video. And it's probably going to need some graphics and stuff. So I'll get back to you on that one. Until then, just stick that one in there. Thanks for joining me in the Blue World. Hit subscribe. Go over and check out Jonathan Bird's Blue World on our other channel. And I hope to see you in the next video.